Welcome back. As US troops prepare to pull out from Iraq over the next 19 months, we're discussing what the future holds for the country. Now from the Al Jazeera studios in London, I'm joined by Patrick Coburn, Iraq correspondent for the British newspaper The Independent. He's an award-winning reporter and was one of the few journalists to remain in Baghdad during the first Gulf War. Patrick's also authored several books on Iraq. Good to have you back on the show, Patrick.
Good to be back.
A quick look at with the timetable the way it is now, 19 months or so expected as the deadline for the removal of the combat troops. In your opinion, is Iraq going to collapse into chaos?
It won't collapse into chaos, I don't think, but you have to bear in mind the extraordinarily high level of violence that we still have. People keep on saying to me that Iraq is better, and that's true, but it's better than the bloodbath that we had a couple of years ago.
Well, we have a caller on the line from London with a question. Zaid's been waiting patiently, so go ahead, Zaid.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask about the dreadful negative interference of Saudi Arabia, and why is it ignored? I mean, we know through many sources of information that they're responsible for 55% of sending homicide bombers into Iraq. They provide the bombers with the religious justifications by the Wahhabi Salafi institution in Saudi Arabia. Why is it totally ignored?
All right. Let me ask Patrick that. I mean, what role do you see Saudi playing in this? Zaid obviously feels that it's got a much more active role that's not being covered.
Well, I mean, a lot of the suicide bombers have come from Saudi Arabia. That's perfectly true. And in some ways it is surprising that more attention hasn't been given to this. All the neighbors of Iraq since the invasion in 2003 have all really participated in one way or another in destabilizing the country.
Well, leads me to ask a question that we've got in our live station chat room that's come in from someone who's logged in as Oves in the UK, who says the US military confirmed that it shot down an Iranian drone, and Iran plans to make better drones. What role will Iran play in Iraq?
Well, Iran has always played a role in what happens in Iraq over the last 5,000 years, and it'll go on playing that role. I think that it's wrong to be as paranoid as many people in America, indeed many Iraqis are, about Iran, because Iraqis basically don't like foreign interference. They didn't like it by America. Most Iraqis want the occupation to end. And they wouldn't like Iranian occupation or interference either. So I think there are limits to Iranian influence, but at the same time it's going to be much greater than it was when Saddam Hussein held power in Baghdad.
Anderson's on the line from South Africa. Anderson, what would you like to ask?
Sorry, I just want to make a comment, not a question.
Okay.
I'm really dismayed at the hypocrisy of the West when it comes to issue of war crimes. You see, nobody has been held responsible for what is happening what has happened in Iraq from the time of invasion in 2003 or thereabout. And I suppose the invasion, which was illegitimate, was unilaterally authorized by George Bush, and a lot of civilians lost their lives. And up to this moment, nobody is talking about holding President George Bush responsible.
Anderson, yeah, actually, let me put that to Patrick. Of course, I just asked Anthony Cordesman. He said there's no real system for accountability in place, and I wonder what your take is on that.
Well, I think that I can see why people feel that war crimes have been committed, but I think the whole issue of war crimes is so difficult to discuss, because usually it's the justice of the victors. So I don't think that even discussing war crimes in relation to Iraq is going to get us very far.
We had an email that came in from Elias Haddad in Brussels, in Belgium, who wrote in saying, "To the dead of Iraq, the war is certainly not a success. To those scratching a miserable living in Iraq, it is not a success. To Halliburton and Blackwater, it is indeed a success." Now, I wonder to what degree, with the way the spotlight was cast on military contractors, and of course what happened with Blackwater basically losing its contract, whether or not the case of military contractors, or the role of contractors, has been redefined by the conflict in Iraq.
Well, a lot of people made an awful lot of money, an amazing amount of money. I mean, this is partly a consequence of the US military having slimmed down and so many activities having been privatized. Now, at the end of the day, they also got a lot of bad publicity, but there are still private security companies there who are still earning top dollar. So I don't think in future they'll be much discouraged.
Now, can the cynics still argue that it's all about the oil, that America was in there for the oil? I mean, looking at the situation, it doesn't seem to have played as much of a role in the recent period.
I've always been very dubious about this argument. You can argue that overall the US was concerned about getting control, a measure of control over Iraq because of its enormous oil reserves. And you know, if Iraq had been a major producer of cabbages rather than oil, there would have been less interest. But I think to imagine that the oil companies wanted to move into Iraq, take over the oil reserves, is very simple-minded and is untrue.
Let's look at the economic situation, Patrick. With the oil production obviously is at nowhere near its potential for Iraq, and prices dropped. Where does this leave the country economically? What's going to happen when it comes down to obviously a large number of troops out of the country? They form a certain amount of the infrastructure economically, and then the general economic situation for Iraqis. What happens next?
Well, the problem in Iraq, or one of the many problems in Iraq, is that so much of the government's money just goes in paying people. Two or 3 years ago, the Iraqi government employed about 1 million people. Now it's up to 2.8 million people. Also, last year, when they thought the price of oil would stay high, they raised their salaries. So these days, about 80% of government revenues go in fixed costs, like paying salaries and pensions and security. They really don't have much left for reconstruction. And although there's a rather more optimistic mood in Iraq these days and a much more optimistic mood outside Iraq, the country is still basically a wreck. It's had 30 years of war and sanctions, and they'll need an enormous amount of money to recover from that.
And that apart, what about the various factions and the interfactional fighting? To what degree has that interfactional hatred built up over the last few years crippled the chance of creating a truly integrated society in Iraq?
I think it'll be extremely difficult. The question is, will people actually fight each other? You know, at one point a couple of years ago, we were having 3,000 bodies every month in the central Iraq, and people still remember that. The last election in January, people were saying this showed a more secular approach, but the changes were all within communities. Shia voted for Shia, Kurds for Kurds, and Sunni for Sunni. So I think it'll take a very long time for this to disappear. You know, I have Shia and Sunni working for me in Baghdad, and often they come to me privately and just saying, don't tell the others where I live. There's still an extraordinarily deep measure of fear of the other community.
Let's squeeze in a caller by the name of Shuhu, who's in Nigeria. Go ahead, Shuhu.
I want to know whether the invasion of Iraq... Hello?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yes, I want to know whether the invasion of Iraq is tied to the security of Israel, as argued by some people, not for oil, just to make Israel secure.
Okay, that's an interesting new angle on it from this discussion. Go ahead, Patrick.
Well, I think, was it directly related? I'm not sure. Was it the people in Washington, the neocons who are close to Israel, who are most in favor of the invasion of Iraq? This was certainly true. Has it done the Israelis any good? I'd have thought exactly the opposite.
We have an email that came in from Mo Walters in Boston in the US, who says, we, the US, have demonstrated quite clearly that we are not the solution and that we are the problem. I hope that someone or some organization, the Arab League, will someday bring calm to Iraq. I wonder, you know, where you see the role of the Arab neighbors in this whole play, and whether or not they can play a greater role in at least stabilizing Iraq post US troop withdrawal.
I think that they'll be, first of all, play less of a role of destabilizing Iraq. While there's a US army there, and when the US first invaded, I remember a senior Iraqi official in the new government saying to me, none of Iraq's neighbors want the US occupation to succeed. These days, I think things are stabilizing. The Sunni states see that it's actually not quite so dangerous to have a Shia Kurdish government in Baghdad. But the amount they can do to stabilize Iraq is fairly limited at this stage.
There was a time when Vice President Joe Biden in the US, was talking about, it was advocating splitting Iraq into 3 sort of sub-countries, I guess, along factional lines. Is that something that could even be entertained now?
I don't think so, because Iraqis really don't want it. The Kurds might want independence, but they can see and keep saying that it's not in their interest at this moment. The other 80% of Iraqis who are Arabs continually say they want to stay within one country. You know, I think where people go wrong is they think that because often Sunni and Shia Arabs are very hostile to each other, that this means that they aren't Iraqi nationalists at the same time. They might have different definitions of Iraqi nationalism, but they're still Iraqi nationalists. They don't want to split the country up. So I don't think Biden's what Biden was saying was ever really feasible. And I'm not sure he really ever proposed the real breakup of Iraq.
Well, 30 seconds to go. What do you think? I mean, let's get your picture with your experience of Iraq. What you think Iraq will look like 5 years from now, Patrick?
Well, I hope that it will remain peaceful. There's still many things unresolved between Sunni and Shia, between Arab and Kurd. And as I said earlier, one of the problems about Iraq is that the country really is a wreck.
Right.
After 30, how many other countries in the world have had 30 years of continual warfare, violence, sanctions, economic siege?
Right.
And it will take 5 years, 15 years to recover from that.
Well, Patrick, I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks. On the next show, renowned author Juan Cole discussing the escalation of the war in Afghanistan and US policies in the Middle East. We'll see you next time.